election campaigning are expected to be reduced. Furthermore, we expected that coronavirus patients were not able to vote because of the quarantine measures, which clearly weakens the legitimacy of the election. Above all, the election itself could cause the nationwide spread of the virus and worsen the situation. Next, please. Prior to talking about what the NIST did under the growing anxiety and concern, I would like to briefly introduce the electoral system in Korea, which will help you better understand the countermeasures we took against the COVID-19 pandemic. The election commissions in Korea have a four-tier organizational structures consisting of the National Election Commission at the central level, 시도 Election Commission at the provincial level, 구시-군 election commissions at the municipal level. Next, please. In Korea, election management process begins with preliminary candidate registration. Candidates, after the registration, may do election campaign for 13 days till the day before an election day. Then there will be actual voting and counting and announcing the elected candidate. Next, please. In Korea, we have various ways of election campaign, from putting posters and banners to giving speeches in a public space to having interviews or advertising on TV and radio and to using internet. Among those traditional campaign methods, public speech is the most affected one because of keeping social distance to prevent COVID-19 from spreading out. So this time, many candidates used contactless forms of election campaign methods such as social media, text message, and email due to the concerns of possible spread of coronavirus infection. Next, please. People in Korea can cast their ballots in these 5 ways: overseas voting, Shepherd voting, early voting, home voting, and election day voting. Those who cannot move freely because of disability, serious illness, or living in military barracks can do home voting. Voters also can do early voting, where they may cast their ballots at every place around the country for 2 days from 5 days prior to election day. Next, please. After voting has closed, ballot boxes are transferred to the competent 구시군 counting centers. We do have ballot sorting machine, but it is only used to have sort ballots by candidate by reading the mark made by the marking device and its location. So therefore, actual counting of the ballots are done manually by counting steps. Next, please. Against the backdrop of growing the concerns and anxieties, the NIST built election management system to respond to the health crisis. Next, please. The National Election Commission set 3 principles for a safe election in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Firstly, NIST made it clear this impacting as much as possible is the best election management to create a safe voting environment. Secondly, the NEC should meet our obligation to guarantee suffrage as much as possible. Thirdly, to fulfill those responsibilities, close cooperation with related organizations cannot be overemphasized. Next, please. EMB in Korea has four-tier organizational structure, as I showed before, and we divided our responsibility for election management by each levels of commissions. The NEC made the policy of the comprehensive COVID-19 response measure, procured disinfection equipment, and carried out voter education while closely collaborating with related government organizations. 17 pseudo election commissions monitored the infection status and supported Gushi-gun election commissions in their competent region. 249 Gushi-gun election commissions secured and trained polling and counting staffs. This impacted the voting and counting place in close cooperation with Unmyeondong community centers in their competent areas. Next, please. What you see is the timetable for the NEC's COVID-19 response plan. On 26th February, we announced the comprehensive COVID-19 response measures that deals with preparing the election and managing polling and counting process. On 12th March, amid the peak of crisis, we implemented special COVID-19 response measures to increase turnout. Then, on 20th March and 2nd April, we put in place the special COVID-19 response measures for voting and counting management, respectively. Next, please. The NEC, in order to secure required resources, maintained a close cooperation with related government organizations, including Ministry of the Interior and Safety, Ministry of Health and Welfare, and Ministry of Economy and Finance, among others. We secured extra 10 to 20% voting and counting staffs in reserve to be ready for the possible loss of staffs due to the quarantine measures arising from the coronavirus infection. We also secured disinfection supplies to create a safe environment for voting and counting process. We, with the priority, secured 18.4 million US dollars of additional budget, which was an increase of approximately 9% of the original budget to respond to over the budget spending to ensure these infection supplies and reserve steps. Next, please. The NEC made efforts to ensure supplies. To create a safe voting environment, we disinfected polling stations and counting centers and put sanitary procedure in place in these places. Also, for separating coronavirus patients while guaranteeing their right to vote, will allow the coronavirus patients and those who are in quarantine to do home voting, and also set up eight special early voting station for the patients. Next, please. Now I'll tell you what the NEC did to respond to the crisis more in details. Next, please. As part of the comprehensive COVID-19 response measure, the NEC canceled or postponed ordinary training programs and did PR activities through broadcasting, newspaper, and social media, and replaced required trainings with online learning. Also, we established contingency plan, including supporting election steps and designating acting commissions in case that election steps at a certain Gushi-gun commission are contracted with the virus to the extent that there are 50% steps unable to perform their duties. Finally, we disinfected all the polling stations and counting centers, established temporary polling stations for those who were found with the symptoms at the polling station entrance, and required all to wear a mask and a vinyl glove, sanitize hands, and get temperature checked before getting inside. Next, please. The NEC made election information material to inform the voters the code of conduct when voting for the election. It was mostly about the basic hygiene and sanitary measures they needed to follow in the polling station. We also made the election guide for voters to be informed of what kind of procedure they need to follow to vote in the polling station. Next, please. Next, please. The NEC made a systemic approach for media and public relations to increase voter turnout. Most importantly, we needed to deliver the message contained in the voter code of conduct and the election guide for the electorate to be well informed of the fact that the polling station would be safe for all the measures we put in place. First of all, the chairperson of the NEC made a public statement claiming the concerns of the public and calling for their participation. We utilized the news and radio comments and TV campaign and subtitles to transmit a broadcasting of message while posting them in the NEC website and in special media platforms, including internet portal, blog, and influencers viral videos. Next, please. The NEC run Korean election broadcasting station. The station made several information video and did real-time broadcasting on the election day. The video they made were about the polling station disinfected, sanitary and hygiene measures implemented, and how to go on a vote while following the voters' code of conduct and election guide. Above all, the station transmitted a live broadcasting showing the real-time images of polling station and counting centers on the election day through social media platform and internet portals. Next, please. The NEC to ensure a safe voting environment by using private companies specialized in disinfection, disinfected every polling stations across the country before and also after voting is carried out. We implemented sanitary and hygiene measures in all the stations including temperature checks at the entrance, disposable gloves, and hand sanitizer provided. 1 meter social distancing also maintained, and even temporary polling booths set up for voters with symptoms such as a high temperature of 37.5 Celsius degree or higher. Yes, please. Originally, home voting is allowed to those who cannot move freely because of disability and etc. Within the existing legal frame, NEC expanded home voting to COVID-19 patients and those who are in quarantine as a way to reduce the number of disenfranchised people due to the COVID-19. Next, please. The NEC also established eight special early voting polling stations to ensure suffrage in the residential treatment center where coronavirus patients were quarantined and being treated. We dispatched polling staffs wearing a level D PPE to manage the election there. Medical staffs had voted before the patients voted while maintaining the social distancing. The ballot envelopes were disinfected and given to post office to be sent to which competent election commissions. Next, please. Korean citizens normally may vote at 176 diplomatic missions in 177 countries around the world. But this time, due to the restrictions on movement by the host country to prevent the spread of virus, Korean citizens in 55 countries were not able to vote. Also, even though people in 17 countries were able to vote, international flights to go to Korea were suspended. So, 18 diplomatic missions counted the ballot directly without air mailing to the NEC in Korea. Next, please. In Korea, after voting has closed, ballot boxes in each polling station are transferred to the competent Gushi-gun counting centers for counting. It means that we needed to take extra caution to ensure safety of counting steps, as many people gather at an enclosed area for a long time, which can be a ground for a cluster infection. To protect people and prevent infection from spreading, we secured places large enough allowing distancing between counting steps and disinfected much as possible. And we also carried out detailed hygiene and sanitary measures at there. Next, please. One of the key measures to create a safe voting environment is to procure enough disinfection supplies. These are the list of the equipment we procured to manage the election. Next, please. Next, please. Thanks to all these efforts, we achieved a significant outcome. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the voter turnout for the 15 April National Assembly election was nearly 66%, which is the record high since 1992. Next, please. Furthermore, It is found that there was no COVID-19 infection case linked to the election. Thank you for your time to listen, and thanks to Indonesia Election Commission for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. That was a very impressive effort made by the Korean Electoral Commission. And we noticed that there has been some early uh, voting system in Korea, and that is very good in the time of pandemic, but for some reasons we could not really do that in Indonesia. So there might be some discussion on that later. And for those who have questions regarding Mr. Kim's presentation, you can use the Q&A feature. Don't forget to mention your name, your agency, and write your question as clear as possible. So thank you once again, Mr. Kim, for your impressive presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next will be Mr. Sushil Chandra from Election Commissions of India. Mr. Chandra, are you with me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, we can hear your voice now and we can see your pictures.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us, Mr. Sushil Chandra. Uh, Perhaps you can also introduce the other persons who are with you in these occasions before starting your presentations. And similar with Mr. Kim, you are allocated 15 to 20 minutes to share your experience in India. So time is yours.
Okay, thank you. I am Sushil Chandra, Election Commissioner of India. And on my right side, Mr. Ashish Kundra is the Deputy Election Commissioner who is looking after the IT initiatives in the ECI. On my left side is Mona Srinivas, who is the Director in Planning and looking after various aspects of the designing and planning of the election process. So today I'll be talking about the various initiatives of IT and other measures which we have taken during Bihar elections with all of you. His Excellency Mr. Arif Udiman, Chairman General Election Commission KPU of the Republic of Indonesia, and his colleague, His Excellency Mr. Glenn Mashnini, Chairperson Electoral Commission of South Africa and Vice Chairperson of ABAP, Mr. Kim Yong-kon, Director Administration and International Affairs, NEC of Republic of Korea, Mr. Manuel Valley, Advisor International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, distinguished delegates from participating EMDs, my colleagues from ECI, ladies and gentlemen. It is my privilege and pleasure to join you all at the webinar on sharing experiences at this virtual election visitors program organized by KPU of Republic of Indonesia during the Indonesian concurrent regional head elections 2020. India and Indonesia share 2 millennia of close cultural, social, and commercial contacts. We have shared histories, myths, and heritage. The relationship between the two countries has emotional roots. The Election Commission of India has also close relationship with the KPU of Indonesia. Both of our commissions are also members of ABAP and Association of Asian Election Authorities. We fondly remember and recall the visit of His Excellency Mr. Arif Budiman, Chairman KPU of Indonesia, and His Excellency Mr. Abhan, Chairman of the Bawaslu, to India for participation in the ABAB 4th General Assembly and International Conference on Initiatives and Challenges of Social Media and Information Technology in elections held from 2nd to 4th September 2019 in Bengaluru. In December 2019, I also had the privilege of participating in the second electoral studies program organized in Bali by the electoral supervisory body, Bawaslu. And I remember the hospitality shown by His Excellency Mr. Abhan in Bali. A delegation led by His Excellency Mr. Arif Budiman, Chairman KPU of Indonesia, participated in the virtual international election visitors program organized by ECI's India ABAB Center from 5th to 7th November during Bihar Assembly elections. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my views on a theme which has become a defining challenge this year for election management bodies around the world. The pandemic has altered the dynamic of every human activity and redefined social interface. Elections are no exception to that. In fact, the entire spectrum of electoral processes run contrary to social etiquette warranted by the contagion. In election, a small step requires social interface. Political campaign in all democracies involves large crowds of people congregating to listen to views of leaders. Voting day sees a large gathering of people queued up around polling stations to exercise their right. Even the counting of votes in designated halls has a large number of security forces and election officials. It is almost like a festival which is felt and felt by the voters whenever an election is held in our country. Needless to say, in nations such as ours, which have a large population base, the risks and challenges are even much greater. Today, I will share with you our experiences of conducting elections during such challenging times, the protocols we developed, the processes we recalibrated, and the technologies we redesigned to make it all happen. Actually, the elections in Bihar but to be completed before November 30th, 2020. Like many other EMBs of the world, we were also faced with the dilemma of how best to conduct an election that would not jeopardize the safety and health of our citizens. We were having challenges before us that should we postpone the democratic right initially, or if we conduct the elections, how safe it can be. We should not be called as a spreader of disease, or how to have a safe elections and without affecting the turnout. We were very much concerned about that if we conduct the election, whether the voters will participate in the election process or they will shy away from that. So there were three challenges before us before we took a decisions in this regard. We had on the ground meetings. Our teams had gone to Bihar, Patna, to discuss with the various authorities. We also had a very long discussions with all stakeholders, including the health ministry officials, the home ministry officials, and other stakeholders like political parties, the voters' bodies, so that we can design, we can calibrate, we can revisit our SOPs so that the election should be absolutely safe. Because once we decided that we will have the election, we will have the elections, then the challenge was before us as to how safe elections can be done without affecting the turnout of the voters. And we decided that we will have the elections. What were the bigger challenges then? That how should we have elections? We had the elections, and to your surprise, we had a larger turnout than the earlier elections of 2015. So, but there were many challenges, and how we overcome that and how we revisited our policies into this. I like to highlight various issues into this regard. In Bihar, which is one of the most populous and a state which is having 38 districts and 73 million voters spread over all 38 districts. And at the time of our decision of making elections, there were around 13,000 patients of COVID-19. So we had to examine as to which districts are more affected, which districts are least affected, and how can we have our more instructions as to how these safe elections can be conducted. We found that 1.8 million migrant voters, which were in different states of India, migrated during this period to Bihar. So the first challenge was that all of them should be first registered with our voter registers. And we found that out of 1.6 million who were eligible to vote, 1.3 million were already registered and enrolled. But the remaining 0.3 million voters were, rapidly enrolled in our registers. Our district officials went personally to their houses and to get them registered. Always strive very hard for that, that our electoral participation should be possible, should be as good as possible, and we don't hesitate in contacting each and every voter in this regard. So, and what we did, that we had to take a lot of new initiatives. First of all, the election commission decided that we will increase the number of polling stations. So far, our polling stations were designed for handling 1,500 voters, but we reduced this to 1,000 voters per polling stations, so that the queues can be shortened and person can easily cast their vote with a social distancing. With this effect, we were already having around 60,000 polling stations. And with this particular decisions, we had to increase our polling stations to 106,000, which was almost 0.1 million, and almost an increase of 60% polling stations. So this was a very huge task actually, that how to manage the safety of 106,000 polling stations, and we can give a confidence to our voter that each and every polling station is safe for casting the ballot. And with this number of increasing of 60% polling stations, the requirement of the manpower, which is required to conduct the elections, also went up very high. And about 0.7 million staff was deployed to conduct these elections, which included the security personnel and the health staff also. Because the new challenge this year was the health of the voters, the safety of the voters. And I can assure you and I can tell you that each and every polling booth, which was numbering in 106,000, there was a nodal officer for the health. And we had discussed this thing in long with the health ministry, and we deployed those nodal officers on almost all the polling booths. So this was a first major decision which was taken. And thereafter, as a second step, we increased the polling hours also by 1 hour from on each and every polling station. So our polling went from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. and last hour was reserved for the persons who were suffering from COVID-19. And if they want to come personally to cast their vote, then that particular hour was fixed for that, so that they should also not be deprived of the polling. We deliberated a lot with all the stakeholders and issued a very detailed guidelines this time, almost for all the fields, all the spheres of the elections. And the first guideline was only for the health management and the booth management as to how they can be, ensure the safety of the voters. The thermal scanning, the social distancing, and the safety norms to be followed at every step of the electoral process. An extensive standard protocol of wearing masks, washing hands, using sanitizer, and following social distancing norms were insisted upon and ensured both at polling stations and at other ventures where with the electoral activities. We procured masks, sanitizers, washing arrangements, and gloves also, so that whenever anybody is casting the vote on the EVM, they should have gloves in their hand, so that there's no chance of any spread of the infection. Nodal officer health was deputed at every polling station in order to take care of every exigency and to monitor that protocols are being followed. Campaigning is another aspect actually, which every political party wants a large congregation. The message can go to the larger population of the voters. But this time, we also restricted the campaigning, though we adopted a hybrid system, a digital campaign also and the physical campaign also. But the physical campaign was restricted in the sense that while a person is coming for even for nomination, then only he will be accompanied by 2 persons. Earlier, he was accompanied by 5 persons. So we reduced the number of the persons who can visit to the RO office while nomination. Similarly, while campaigning, it was ensured that all the grounds in which the physical campaigning is being done, only those number of persons will be allowed to attend which are in conformity with the social distancing norms. And for that, our district administration, the DOs, and all the districts collected the details of various places where the rallies were being held. And we put the circles at a distance of 2 meters so that a proper safe distancing is maintained. And the number of persons who are attending the rallies is restricted so that there's no chance of spreading the virus and the social distance is maintained. Similarly, for door-to-door campaign, we restricted the number of persons to 5, and no more than 5 persons will go from door to door to campaign for the voting, and they will also maintain the social distancing. And the district administration was made responsible for that. That the law enforcement agencies, that the administration will look into this aspect very clearly, and action will be taken against the persons who violate the social distancing norms. So this was absolutely hybrid system for our campaigning, and therefore that campaigning could go well as well. Various parties actually, when we were discussing with the political parties, some of the political parties were of the view that it should be only digital campaigning, and some political parties wanted no, that we should have a physical campaigning so that we can convince the persons actually in person. So we allowed both of them, and a hybrid system was adopted. Special arrangements were also put in place to facilitate COVID positive quarantined voters in the last hour of the poll with polling staff in PPE kits. We even provided the PPE kits to our staff officials and to the persons who are coming to cast the vote so that actually the vote can take, casting of the vote can take place, and there should be no person who should left behind from casting of the vote. We also extended the postal ballot facility to electors with the persons with disabilities, electors aged 80 plus, and those who are COVID positive under quarantine. More than 12 lakhs such voters were given postal ballot facility at their doorstep by our election officials. But you will be surprised to note that in spite of this option, an overwhelming majority of such voters prefer to visit the polling stations than voting from the home. Such is the confidence reposed by the voters in the Election Commission of India. They want to come to the polling stations, they want to cast their vote, and only very few persons chose to cast their postal ballot, because we even deputed our officers to go to their home and to collect the postal ballot. Similarly, distribution and receipt of polling material was heavily decentralized. And the counting, as far as counting is concerned, the number of counting locations was increased from 38 to 55, and the number of counting tables in each hall was reduced from 14 to 7 to maintain a social distancing among the election staff who's involved in the counting of votes. But I must share with you that despite such a massive increase in terms of the spread of election infrastructure, the counting of more than 40 million votes was completed, and results for all 243 constituencies were declared before dawn of the next day. So in much less than around in 20 hours, we could count all the votes and we could declare all the results in all 243 constituencies. The collection and disposal of biomedical waste, which was also an important issue, and we cannot be ignorant to the environment. So biomedical waste was emerged as another challenge for the EMBS, and in Bihar, elaborate guidelines were drawn for tagging of polling stations and other places where biomedical waste was generated, and the steps were taken for its safe disposal. Another area which I would like to highlight is the SWEEP program, that is our Systematic Voters Education and Electoral Participation Program. Because there was a big challenge as to how to communicate with the voters. We are making our polling stations safe. We are getting them sanitized. We are providing the sanitization material to the voters, but how to convince our 73 million voters in Bihar that please come, cast your vote, the polling station is safe. So we put this SWEEP program, that voters education program, in full swing by using even the community radio program, the digital means, the digital media, the multimedia forums, including the advertisement at various places, and so that the voters can be confident, the voters can be spoken about it, the confidence can be generated in them that please come, you have to cast your vote, and the polling stations are safe. And I'm very happy to say that this program was absolutely successfully completed, because of which our turnout was much more than the last elections, and the person participated in spite of being, in spite of having a COVID-19. So the election commission's efforts absolutely were quite fruitful, and we were vindicated by the voters of the Bihar that they could repose, they could have a complete faith in the system of electoral process, and they cast their vote. For these particular this all processes, we use various technological inputs also, and we've been asked to tell about the various technology which initiatives which we have taken. Though in detail, my colleague Mr. Ashish Kundra will give you a full presentation, but nevertheless, I would like to mention various important technological innovations and the technology, how we helped how the technology helped us into improving our electoral system during this COVID-19 period. Because technology can be leveraged in such a scenario, both to enhance the transparency and credibility of election, and also to minimize person-to-person contact. For many years now, ECI has used the latest technology to reach out to more and more people. Today, we have created a unified digital data base of over 920 million electors in the country. We have online facility for enrollment as voter, making changes in the voter details and checking name in electoral roll online. Candidates and political parties are offered a unified digital interface to obtain permissions, file election expenditures, and many such activities. This time, we also introduced the facility for online filing of nomination. This is the first time in India that we have used this facility, and we generated our system, we developed our system that the candidates can file online nomination, and they need not to come and wait for a long time before in the RO office. So, and many candidates, many political candidates have utilized this particular online facility and have filed their nomination on this platform. PWD voters, electors are facilitated through a PWD app. We have developed a app for the benefit of the person with disabilities, and that gives basically that whether they require any assistance at polling booth and any vehicles which is required for them, and we facilitate their absolute approach to the polling stations. We provided a vehicle, we provided them all assistance at the booth, so that the persons with PWD could cast their votes. An important thing is the C Vigil also. This is an app which empowers the citizens of the country to report anything which is adverse and against the violation of a model code of conduct, and that the action is taken within 100 minutes after getting any complaint in this regard. And as you are all aware that we conduct our polling on the EVM and the VVPAT, that electronic voting machine, and the VVPAT, which is a transparent system of casting the vote. And during this election, we have used more than 110,000 and means around 0.1 million EVMs and VVPATs in all our polling booths. And this was a very important aspects of casting very credible and very transparent system of casting the vote. And we also use the ETPBS, this electronically transmitted paper ballot system, for our defense personnel and the persons who are posted abroad into the essential services. And through this, we transmitted around 160,000 ballots electronically, which were mailed and subsequently and taken up for a manual count. Including the CO Bihar also developed some apps for the training of the election official, which were also very beneficial, and that avoided the person-to-person contact. So that was a good technology which we use for educating the staff. We use it for the voters and to help the citizens of the country to report any manipulations or any mishandling of the persons. Even as I speak with all of you, we are now gearing up for the next round of elections. 4 large provinces and a union territory are scheduled for elections over the next few months. The election machinery in each of these states is already in the process of deploying even deeper technology solutions for safer elections. As the year 2020 draws a close, it is indeed an opportunity for all of us to look back at the challenge humanity faced in this year. There is a sudden realization of something we always knew, that the world, despite its national, linguistic, religious, and myriad other differences, is one single whole where mankind has lived and flourished. It is a feeling of togetherness, of being one in the cosmos. I look forward to happier and healthier 2021 as we inch closer to a vaccine that will relieve us all of the deadly virus and make it a thing of the past. Challenges and problems will continue to confront us, but hope, faith, and conviction will always carry us through. This is my firm belief. Thank you so much for listening to me patiently. Now, in 5 minutes, my colleague Mr. Ashish Kundra will just give a slideshow on the.
Good afternoon. I'll give a quick snapshot of how we leverage the IT tools for conduct of elections. Um, COVID-19, of course, for elections posed enormous challenge, as Chandra sir has just highlighted. Safety was a primary concern, and social distancing, of course, became the new normal. The idea was, how do you inspire trust of the electorate that the arrangements are safe? How do you manage crowds both at the polling station and at the campaign ground? And of course, for the staff, your own staff, how do you ensure that it's safe? The vulnerable segments, those who are aged and those who are physically challenged, also had to be catered to. Technology, of course, was an enabler, and we try to leverage technology tools to overcome these challenges. So, just a quick snapshot of Bihar with 73 million electors and more than 730,000 election staff was deployed for conduct of elections. The first step was, of course, registration of electors. We have an online platform for registration, both by way of a mobile application and a web-based application. And ahead of the election, more than 2.2 million forms were received. More than a third of them were online. And that, for a state which is primarily a rural state, is, I think, a big shift which we witnessed. Then migrant population, as was pointed out, were also kind of enrolled in this process. Voter education. There was a voter guide which was prepared for all voters to kind of educate them about all safety protocols, and all kinds of digital tools were used, including WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, to drive home the point that your safety is paramount and it is in your best interest to wear masks, to maintain social distancing, and so on. For candidates, as was pointed out, in India, we have a tradition that whenever a candidate goes to file his nomination, they go in large numbers. So this time, we kind of introduced this online filing of nominations, including the payment of these deposits by the candidates. There is a mobile application, which was a single point of interface for all candidates and political parties to secure permissions online, whether for public spaces, rallies, meetings, etc. And a large number, more than 45,000 permissions were granted through this platform. C-Vigil is an application by which it's like crowdsourcing of complaints from voters. If they see that there is some let us say violation of the model code of conduct which has been notified by the Election Commission, they are able to click a picture or a video, upload it with a time evidentiary stamping, so that we know that where it happened, and then a team rushes to the spot to redress the complaint. Within 100 minutes, the mandate was that within 100 minutes, the team has to resolve the problem. The electronic voting machine, of course, is a huge asset which has been used now for a considerable length of time. This application basically is a single focal point for end-to-end tracking of the machine, from the moment it leaves the warehouse till the time it reaches the polling station. And there's a randomization tool so that nobody knows which machine is allocated for which polling station. Um, for persons with disabilities, there's a mobile application which enables people to self-mark themselves, indicating the kind of disability that they are suffering from. And while the postal ballot facility was introduced this time for the 80 plus voters and also for people with disabilities, those who wanted to go to the polling booth, they could give an online request for a wheelchair, and also for doorstep assistance where required. For defense personnel, those who are posted on the borders, it has always been a challenge how to secure their ballots. So we have introduced the system of transmitting the ballot electronically, which is then brought back by mail and counted as a postal ballot. Personnel management, again, a large number of staff. Again, we have to ensure for fair play and transparency that no one knows to which polling station they are allocated. And there is a randomization tool which was used for this purpose. There's a mobile application which was deployed for training and also ensuring that everybody, because normally we have been accustomed to in India to have a face-to-face training session. But this time, this was a big challenge, and fortunately, using tools such as the one we are using right now, we were able to overcome them. So digital training program on law, on procedure, on use of electronic voting machine, on safety protocols were all hammered in for the polling staff, all through digital medium. On the poll day, the management of polling stations, the queue management, safety, sanitization for more than 100,000 polling stations was a mammoth task. And of course, in rural areas where sometimes access is a challenge also, it was even more difficult. Electronic voting machines, we have already kind of flagged that point. We also had a booth application, which although was not used in Bihar, but in other assembly by-elections which were held, where people can, there's a QR code solution where somebody goes with a photo voter slip, it is scanned, and anybody who's wanting to go to vote can see how many people are in the queue at the moment. So in a way, it is a queue tracker as well, and also gives real-time voter turnout at the booth for us. Now, the vulnerable segment, more than 1.6 million people which were in the aged or the people with disabilities, we made special arrangements to ensure that, that their safety was paramount for us. And as Mr. Chandra just mentioned, that in spite of everything, they chose to go to the booth instead of voting by post. Webcasting, we out of the 100,000 polling stations, 10,000 polling stations were picked randomly, and there was a live web streaming which was monitored both by the Chief Electoral Officer at the state headquarters and the Election Commission of India in Delhi. The idea was we wanted to make sure that there is an orderly crowd management, and if at all we saw that there is some gap somewhere, the concerned people could be alerted and rectifying measures could be taken. And counting, of course, we have a unified web portal which kind of gives round-wise the data is entered, the EVM counts and the postal ballot count is entered, and automatically then the results are collated and displayed online. And that's how we were able to kind of finish all that in good time. That's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we can see that India is very much ahead of us in terms of the use of technology, and it is interesting that you have electronic voting machines all over the country, which is no less than 450,000 machines. And we noticed that you also send the ballot electronically to those who are casting their votes in remote areas. and they return the votes by mail. Saya kira ini menarik untuk dipertimbangkan di Indonesia ya, mengirimkan surat suara secara elektronik, nanti pemilih bisa mencetaknya lalu mengirimkannya ke titik-titik tertentu. Cuma nanti kalau di Indonesia pertanyaannya bagaimana soal kemurnian dan keaslian kira-kira nanti. Bisa jadi isu politik yang panas di daerah. So thank you once again to all of you in India. It's really useful. Dan for the audience, once again, I want to remind you, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A features. Don't forget to mention your name, your agency, and write your questions concisely and clearly. And make sure that you can also address your question to specific resource person. So audience, next we will have Dr. Manuel Wally. Dr. Wally, are you with me?
Yes, I am, sir.
I assume you are in the Washington, D.C.
I'm actually in Brazil, Commissioner.
I'm sorry, where are you now?
In Brazil right now.
Oh, in Brazil. So it's still evening in there or early in the morning?
Early in the morning, Commissioner.
So thank you for joining us. And so Dr. Manuel Wali is the legal advisor for the IFES headquarters, and similar with the previous resource persons, I will allocate 15 to 20 minutes for you to present to do your presentations. So you can start now for your 15 to 20 minutes. Time is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be part of this high-level panel. I wanted to thank already the commissioners and chairman of the commissions of India and South Korea for their brilliant presentations. I've learned a lot already. I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation, which I will share instantly. I will be speaking exclusively about vote by mail, starting perhaps with a brief global overview. We've heard already that the commissions in South Korea and in India expanded the ambit of voters who were allowed to vote by mail because of COVID. And this is something that happened in many other countries to varying degrees and to varying uptake by the voters. Just historically, to go back, voting by mail in many countries started for out-of-country voting, where countries have large diasporas in certain countries, and that diaspora lives spread out and far away from a diplomatic mission. Many countries opted to mail ballots to those out-of-country voters. And that's been going on for quite a long time. And as a more recent development, more and more countries have begun also to allow voting by mail in country. There are still 46 countries in the world, and these are just 4 examples, some of the major democracies that provide vote by mail only out of country. Italy, for example, held a referendum this year. France held local elections. And they allow the out-of-country voters to vote by mail, but they don't allow mail voting in country. And that's 46 countries. Indonesia is one of the countries that provides for vote by mail out-of-country optional. And here's quickly a map of the world that shows what types of out-of-country voting countries provide for. The countries marked in yellow allow out-of-country voting only by mail, and then the countries in purple provide for multiple options. When we talk about voting by mail in country, there's really 2 different types of by mail voting. One would be called, in the US at least now, absentee voting. And absentee voting requires the voter to request a mail-in ballot or to be placed on a special list under certain conditions. While universal vote by mail, the election administration would mail a ballot to every registered voter. And this practice can be seen in Switzerland, for example, where every voter is automatically sent a ballot. It can also be seen in referenda and local elections in New Zealand and Australia. So here we're talking specifically about low turnout elections, frequent referenda and local elections that see lower turnout than national elections, and also for cost considerations, but also to boost turnout. These countries have turned to postal voting. And the same is true for many of the Western states in the US, Oregon, Colorado, Hawaii, Washington State, and Utah. And then there were instances of countries, or states rather, that switched from absentee voting. As I said, in Germany, there is absentee voting, but in the state of Bavaria that held elections at the same time as South Korea at the peak of the pandemic, with an electorate of about 10 million voters, they switched to universal mail voting for their runoff for the local elections because they had COVID cases in the first round transmitted at polling stations. So they decided to send a mail-in ballot to every one of those 10 million voters. And it worked quite well. If we look at postal voting in country in Europe, it's not as many countries as one would think. Ireland is an interesting case because Ireland doesn't have out-of-country voting, but they have postal voting in country. So I had been speculating, what if an out-of-country voter orders a ballot in country and then has it sent to them, then hypothetically they could vote out of country. This is an interesting map. It was big political controversy in Poland. The elections were scheduled for June this year. Again, it wasn't the peak, but it was still a very strong pandemic rate at that time. And the government proposed to hold all mail voting and presented it as a package which comported shifting the power to manage the elections from the Independent Election Commission to the Postal Service. And the opposition rejected that. So ultimately the elections were postponed rather than held by postal vote, even though even the postponed elections allowed individual districts to conduct voting by mail, and 2 of those districts did so, districts that had the highest COVID rates. In the United States, postal voting in country goes back to the Civil War. Again, like we heard from India, servicemen who were dispatched away from the place of voter registration were already being provided postal ballots then. So this is the 1860s, and there were some fraud allegations at that time. But postal voting was preserved in the US, also in country, and some states advanced it much more briskly than other states. And for the pandemic, in addition to the 5 states that I've named before, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, Utah, and Colorado, another 5 states joined the universal postal vote group of states in the US, which was one of the things that sparked controversy because certain political forces were and remain opposed to sending every voter a ballot, even though that is proven to be incorrect, that there's a political bias in that. The legal framework also changed temporarily in many US states that required specific grounds to request an absentee ballot, and fear of COVID infection was added as a ground to request an absentee ballot in a very large number of US states. A few states remained behind and did not allow that. But again, in 34 states in the US, fear of COVID was a ground to request an absentee ballot. States that don't have universal ballot distribution, but where absentee ballots must be requested. And then a number of US states, 9 states, mailed an absentee ballot request form to every registered voter, which also was quite a novelty on grounds of COVID. And then there is a growing number of online portals where voters were able to request absentee ballots online, which obviously shortened the time span that was necessary. Rather than having 3 or 4 postal round trips, you have an online application and the ballot is mailed out and then mailed back. So you only have 2 trips by mail. And then there were 7 states that did not accept fear of COVID as a grounds to request an absentee ballot. Texas, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, this does not suffice to be afraid of infection to request an absentee ballot. But it's a small minority of states. Now, vote by mail obviously can bring certain benefits, can ease access for persons with disabilities, especially people with mobility issues. And but it's interesting if we look at the evolution here of the growth of vote by mail of persons with disabilities and persons without disabilities, it moves in lockstep. And so voters with disabilities seem to want to do what voters without disabilities are doing. It's also that some jurisdictions have been using the provision of postal voting as a pretext not to make polling stations accessible, wheelchair accessible. So that is obviously something that needs to be avoided. Generally speaking, vote by mail also needs additional features. Like, for example, the Election Commission of India said that ballots are being transmitted electronically. If that is done, there can be special features added for persons with disabilities to use their devices, the home-based computer devices, to complete the ballot. So electronic ballot transmission is quite important for the PD community. I'm now turning to timelines because timelines are extremely important for postal voting. And as you know, as opposed to the other 3 panelists from South Africa, India, and South Korea, the United States does not have a centralized election administration. It's very heavily decentralized. There's about 8,800 counties that conduct separate elections in the US under 50 state laws. But again, even within states, the practice of counties can be quite different. The timelines are regulated by state law. And one of the issues that came up for expanding vote by mail, and it was exposed quite starkly over the primary elections earlier this year in the US, when about 550,000 postal votes were received by the election administrations after the cutoff date and were invalidated. So there was a strong fear that this was going to recur at the general elections. Interestingly enough, it didn't. I'll go into the reasons why it didn't, but just in terms of looking at the legal framework, we still have 16 states that allow voters to apply for an absentee ballot just a few days before the election date, but then require the ballot to arrive on election date. And those are these states marked here in orange. So there needs to be some sort of revision of those timeframes. If we look at the states, you cannot see them now, but the light blue states, in California, for example, a ballot can arrive by mail up until 3 weeks after election day, as long as it's postmarked by election day, and it will still be counted as valid. So there's very strong discrepancies among these cutoff dates between different states. And the distinction here between certain states and others is that some states require the ballot to arrive on election day, the postal ballot, while other states require the postal ballot to be postmarked by election day, but will count it for a certain number of days or even weeks after the election day. What was very interesting, and one of the reasonings why there weren't so many late coming ballots at the general election when compared to the primaries, or even when compared to the 2016 election, is the intensity at which mail ballots are mailed in. And one of the aims was to flatten the curve so that what you can see here is most of the ballots still arrived very briefly before election day or on election day by mail. And this was the 2018 election, midterm election, I believe. While at the general election this year, ballots arrived very early. Like, for example, in Georgia right now for the Senate runoff, voters really mail in their request their ballots and mail them in very early. So they were sensitized through the media also. And because of the ballot losses at the primaries, voters are keenly aware and heed the timelines. So one of the issues, one of the problems, one of the challenges of postal voting when compared to polling station voting is the inability to reconcile the number of ballots provided with the number of votes cast and the ballots remaining. Because some voters who request and receive mail ballots or automatically receive them may simply decide to abstain. And that number is very, very difficult to gauge. So there is an issue with chain of ballot custody in postal voting. And the US in the general elections, even when compared to the primaries from earlier this year, made enormous strides in tracking ballots. There's always been a tracking of the ballot itself with a barcode in order to prevent double voting. So when the ballot arrives, it's scanned in and the voter is marked off as having voted with that barcode that's on the ballot. So that prevents double voting. But the bigger issue at the primaries was that a lot of ballots were lost in the mail. So voters were demanding to be able to track their ballots, and that can be done with a mail barcode. It's called a STID, Service Type ID. And most jurisdictions, I believe over 90% of the jurisdictions in the US right now, mail out their postal ballots with that type of tracking that then allows the voter to see where their ballot is in the postal stream and not only upon receipt. My colleague Staffan Darnolf, some of you might know, for example, voted in Maryland, and he received an email. He opted into that. He received an email once his ballot was received by the election administration and counted as valid. And that is important because sometimes postal voters forget, to date the ballot or to sign the ballot. By law in many US states, they have the right to cure, to rectify their clerical errors in order to have their ballot counted. And the tracking allows the election administration to notify voters either by SMS or by email that they need to come in and fix their ballot, or even SMS in an affidavit that it was in fact them who cast the ballot, and that would then make the ballot valid. One of the reasons why the rate of late ballots was relatively low at the general elections was the expansion and the introduction of ballot drop boxes. Those drop boxes have video surveillance. Many laws regulate, the opening hours, the process of emptying them, where they can be placed, how they must be secured. And the advantage of that is that you could have postal voting without using the postal service at all. I, for example, also received my out-of-country voting ballots as a PDF attachment from New York. So if you receive the ballot electronically, you print it at home, you complete it, and then you drop it in a drop box rather than the mail service. The risk of mail failure is entirely eliminated. And in Colorado at this point, one of the states that has the longest postal voting history in the US, about 80% of voters drop their postal ballots into drop boxes rather than the mail. The same in Germany. I think in Germany is about 60% now using drop boxes, and also in Switzerland. The independence of the postal service can very much be an issue, as we've heard about Poland, where the postal service is under a government ministry. And there was also controversy in the US because a new postmaster general had been appointed who eliminated critical sorting infrastructure for flat mail, since most postal services are now shifting to parcel mail with e-commerce. And election mail is obviously flat mail. So sorting capacities had been reduced just in the run-up to the elections. Then there's a number of countries actually a small number of countries that require postal ballots to be sent by registered mail. And South Korea is one of them. Austria and Luxembourg are the others. And Bosnia and Herzegovina requires voters to return postal ballots by registered mail. That obviously eliminates the suspicion that ballots are just left in a building lobby and somebody can just pick them up and commit imposter voting. So if it's registered mail, then the voter signs for the ballot receipt and closes that vulnerability. But there's a cost issue attached to registered mail. It's quite expensive. Now, one of the issues the states in the US faced was a lot of the states that didn't really have postal voting traditionally didn't have infrastructure to count postal ballots in mass. They used to get 5,000 or 10,000 postal ballots, and now with the epidemic, with the pandemic, much larger numbers of voters in the US opted in to postal voting. So many states needed to centralize results management rather than let individual small counties handle it. And they had to procure machines to slice open the envelopes and then to optically scan the postal ballots for counting. Then there were more vulnerabilities in terms of ballot validity. Some states require a double envelope to ensure voter secrecy, while others didn't. Pennsylvania required, for example, the secrecy envelope. And then there was controversy about ballots that arrived without the second envelope, whether those were valid or not. They were called naked ballots. So it's a question of how important the secrecy of the vote is to certain jurisdictions when deciding to use a double envelope or not. Certainly requires voter information, not to forget the second envelope. One of the challenges with universal vote by mail is obviously, and New Zealand ran into this when they held their flag referendum, is to ensure that the voter database is accurate by the time you send out ballots to every registered voter. And New Zealand realized, I think they received 38,000 ballots back as non-deliverable. And most postal voting systems use, at least in the US, use non-forwardable mail services. So if a voter has moved and the address hasn't been updated, they will not receive their ballot. So one of the conclusions that the New Zealand Election Commission came up with is that before they send out live ballots, they should do a postcard mailer to make sure that all addresses are current. Again, signatures are a big issue in the US. Some states began to procure electronic signature matchers. It's difficult because a lot of people's signatures change if you have a stroke or a fraction, or you suffer from Parkinson. Any of these events can change your signature, and it remains controversial. Australia has an interesting solution for postal voting, where they allow voters to pick a secret question and then they provide the answer on their return ballot envelope and can be identified, authenticated by the answer to their secret question. Establishing a PIN would be another way, easy way to authenticate the voter identity. One of the main advantages of postal voting, obviously, is that it's paper-based and it's recountable. Georgia had 3 recounts now, Wisconsin had 1. So if that would have been a method that wasn't recountable, it would have caused a lot more controversy. But because it's paper-based, it's highly recountable. Now, in terms of turnout, we've heard a lot about turnout. Postal voting helped drive up the turnout in the US. This is a chart that shows the up until 2016, the share of postal votes and early votes of overall votes. And this curve, if this curve were updated, the green line, which represents the share of postal votes cast, now actually surpasses the purple line on top, which is the number of votes cast on election day at the polling station. So at the general elections, more people voted by mail in the US than voted at the polling station on election day. Then another 35 million people voted early in person at polling stations. So overall, over 100 million votes were cast before election day, and under 60 million votes were cast on election day at polling stations. And over 65 million ballots were cast by mail in the US general election. Unfortunately, we can't see the right column right now, but it will show you the growth. Again, it's over 100 million now votes cast before election day. And what is interesting is that this is traditionally one always thought that older people would vote by mail, but what voting by mail did in the US, it especially brought first-time voters and younger voters into the democratic process. So the percentage of young voters that cast vote by mail was especially high. And here you can see a state-by-state breakdown of where postal voting was before the pandemic and where it is now. So in some states, it grew much more exponentially than in others. In terms of cost, New Zealand is an interesting example where you can see that the per registered voter cost for their elections held in person, for the general elections, parliamentary elections, for example, which they've also now held during the pandemic, is 8.18 New Zealand dollars versus less than 3 New Zealand dollars for the postal voting referendum per registered voter cost. Australia made a similar experience with a plebiscite that they held entirely by mail recently that cost 80 million Australian dollars versus 227 million Australian dollars for the polling station general elections. Colorado saved about $6 per voter by universalizing vote by mail. Most of these states still operate polling centers on election day because they have same-day registration, and that obviously you can only do if you have polling centers open. And other US jurisdictions, Orange County, California, for example, save between $2 and $5 per registered voter through postal voting versus setting up polling stations. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a great honor to be part of this panel. I'd like to thank KPU for the invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wally. Thank you. The questions will be addressed by the audience in text later. Yeah, sent by mail if you like. Hadirin, mari kita beri applause dulu untuk Dr. Wally. Thank you very much once again. So it is interesting how during the pandemic, the number of voters casting their votes by mail was substantially higher than those who cast their mails in person in the US. So probably if we have that kind of system installed in Indonesia, we may expect that the number of voters casting their votes by mail will be higher in these simultaneous elections in Indonesia. But unfortunately, we don't really have that kind of system in hand. So once again, thank you, Dr. Manuel Wali, for very interesting presentations and data. And we can also see that there are some savings, if you like, in the budget allocations caused by the mail votes and early vote in the US. So audience, last but not least, we will have Mr. Glenn Mashinini, Chairperson of Election Commission of South Africa. Are you with me already? Good afternoon from Indonesia.
Good afternoon.
Is it still morning in your country?
No, it is 11 o'clock in the morning. Thank you.
11 o'clock, yeah. Still morning, almost.
Yes.
So thank you for being with us. So you will be the last resource person, and I believe it will be a very interesting presentation from you. You will have 15 to 20 minutes. Time is yours, Mr. Mashinini.
Thank you. Thank you, and just request the presentation to be put up. Chairman of the Indonesian Election Commission, KPU, Mr. Budiman, commissioners and representatives of the KPU, fellow panelists, Mr. Chandra, Commissioner of Election Commission of India, Mr. Yong Kwon, the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea, Dr. Wally, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, session moderator, Mr. Karim, members of the election management bodies and electoral democracy organizations present today, members of the media who are here with us, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Electoral Commission of South Africa, let me thank you for inviting us to share our experiences in holding of elections under the COVID elections or conditions. Mr. Chairman, before I proceed, I am reminded that 65 years ago to today, a historic gathering of the peoples of Africa and Asia took place in a town called Bundang in Indonesia. This gathering marked the solidarity among our peoples. And today we are gathering again to share experiences in addressing the challenges of today as those founding fathers and leaders of the time, led by the then president of Indonesia, President Sukarno, together with the president of India, President Nehru, and many other leaders, including leaders from my country. So it is my singular honor that I am today being invited to continue that spirit of cooperation and solidarity and exchanges among us. Although today it is even about how we continue the project of self-determination and democracies of our nations. Allow me, Mr. Chair, to proceed, as we know that we are speaking here about the pandemic that has befallen humankind globally. We know that the COVID-19 has actually presented the world with one of the greatest challenges of modern era. Almost no aspect of our lives, our economies, our societies, and work has not been touched by the pandemic and the various responses by governments around the world. Within the realm of electoral democracy, where our mandates as EMBs lie, the electoral democracy, COVID has been postponed by many countries, or in some cases, it has been cancelled. According to statistics compiled by the International IDEA, at least 70 countries and territories have postponed elections since the outbreak of the pandemic early this year. Yet, despite these challenges, a number of countries have continued with their elections with varying degrees of success and turnout. And this trend of resuming elections is growing around the world as we begin to come to terms with what some of us have now called it the new normal. Similarly, in South Africa, we've had now to grapple with the issue of, or the phenomena of the COVID-19. Now, South Africa is a constitutional democracy. We have to start from there as to say what provisions do we have to deal with the pandemic. And one of the things that is unique about the South African constitution, it expresses quite clearly that the term of office is prescribed to be done for the period of 5 years, and it comes to an end. There is no provision for extension of that term of office. And a new administration or government has to come into office within 90 days. So if you miss that, time frame, then you could plunge the country into a constitutional crisis. Now, in our case, we're fortunate that during the year that year 2020, there's been no general elections scheduled. And we are not sure how we would have been able to handle had that been the case during also the level 5 lockdown, that the state of disaster that we are still under. But under level 5, you could not do anything. You were confined. We were confined. It was a hard lockdown. We were confined almost 24 hours in our own homes. We have now the next general elections, which will be our municipal elections in 2021. However, during the period of the COVID lockdown, ward councillor vacancies, arose almost monthly, and we were supposed to make sure they are filled within 90 days. As I said earlier on, the only way then you can postpone those particular elections is if you approach the electoral court. And our legislation in South Africa provides only for registration and voting in person. So these are some of the challenges and issues that we faced, and the commission, in light of those things, then opted to apply to the electoral court to postpone all scheduled by-elections between March and September this year. And there are two primary reasons why the commission took that route. Firstly, it was the strict lockdown conditions and movement controls imposed to curb the spread of the virus during the height of the pandemic in our country. And this did not allow for free political campaigning, and and the conditions were not conducive to free and fair elections. The second consideration, it was to prevent the spread of the virus and the threats to the lives of the voters, the election officials, the candidates, and other stakeholders. In other words, we didn't want to plunge the country, the elections turning out to be a super spreader of the pandemic. And the background also being that we're talking about a developing country which has got a mixed bag of conditions, infrastructure, and capability to actually cope with the protocols of the pandemic. Fortunately, as time has progressed, there was therefore the easing of the spread of COVID by September in the country, and the reduction of the lockdown was brought to level 1, which allowed for the political gatherings, and we were able to reschedule all the outstanding by-elections, and which therefore took place on the 11th of November. And this is the experience then we have called it, that it was actually our dry run for next year's national local government elections, because this then gave us a window and the first opportunity to actually see how we can apply the protocols that we've been engaged with our counterparts throughout the world in exchanging, to see then how then we can apply in our own environment, because we needed to customize to the South African situation. And thus then these by-elections provided us this experience, which I'm actually sharing with yourselves today. And the municipal by-elections that we were to cover were about 95 wards and 55 municipalities. And we have 9 provinces, and almost all the provinces of our country were included in the election. So it became a mini local government election. And this involved nearly 600,000 registered voters, of whom about 230,000 voted physically in the polling stations. Now, in order to prevent the by-elections posing a risk to all participants, the commission introduced a range of special COVID prevention measures. And I think in the presentation with all the previous speakers and in the exchanges that we were exposed with our counterparts of the EMBs, both in the continent and under the umbrella of the AWEB, we as the Electoral Commission South Africa were able then to actually learn the best lessons and the best practices that we can apply in our conditions. Some of them include that the strict social distancing practices, both outside and inside the voting stations, the mandatory wearing of masks over nose and mouth of all persons within the boundaries of the voting stations, the application of hand sanitizers to all persons entering the voting stations, the replacement of traditional indelible ink marker pens with indelible ink liquid, which will be applied from a bottle to the thumb of the voters using a cotton buds, which will be disposed. And one of the things that the protective equipment included masks, gloves, and face shield was procured for election staff for the voting stations and for conducting the home visits where we do have special voters, people that we need to physically visit, such as people who are physically disabled, infirmed, or pregnant. We have to physically go to their premises. But interestingly, one of the things that one will point out, which we see our counterparts, EMBs, have done, we didn't have the testing temperature checks in our voting stations. And one of the reasons we had is that we don't have the capacity to cope with a person if then the person tests otherwise. What do you do? The resources, the capacity to deal with it is not there. Largely, we just sanitize and hope that the turnaround time is sufficient for a person to come in and go out, and all our personnel in the protective gear, and they're observing the protocols. As we can see in the diagram here, we can see our staff members that were able to conduct the election, these local elections. We as the commission were therefore extremely pleased with the success of these elections. One of the things is that I actually, with my colleagues, we went around different voting districts and stations during this period of time. And the positive response on the ground of the voters and the political parties, candidates, and various stakeholders to the special COVID prevention measures was very encouraging to us as the commission. And remember, as we said, is that this was giving us a dry run because it was the first time we ventured to do electoral activity during the COVID. And all the protocols and all the measures we put in, they came out tops. They were well embraced by the various parties. So when one was on the ground, on the field, we had a wonderful opportunity to ascertain from the cold face what exactly were the views. And I must say, it was very impressive. And in some of the villages, in the villages that are in the outskirts of our country, we hear that some of the people, when they saw our staff members, special voters coming with the uniform as if they were coming from the ICU, some of them ran away thinking that maybe they want to take me to hospital. And some of the elderly people in the rural communities, they just don't like going to hospital. They want medicine at home. So it was a very impressive show by our team. And then on the other side, the turnout and under the circumstances, we also gauged and assessed the voter turnout. And the good news was that it was almost in line with the average turnout in similar by-elections over the past few years. Now, I think one thing that one should also just draw, especially from the presentation of Dr. Wale, is that we don't have the option in our situation of too many modalities. For example, one of the modalities that we talk about is having an online voting. We don't have that capability. The other modality is postal voting. The postal voting in our country is a non-starter. So we've had to do with what you call with what we have at the moment. Now, what I was going to share is broadly the model that deals with the electoral cycle, but I think I'll pass that because a lot of it has been actually indicated in the discussion by the other speakers. I'll just go to what were the main challenges that we see, and probably for other EMPs is the issue that the economic impact that the COVID has had in our economies. And therefore, if we go into that, it has dealt a blow, and this has affected the fiscus of our countries. And the resources required to do this work with less is one of the major challenges that we see, and we would like just to share with yourselves, in the sense that now we have to what you call increase the measures and the resources to deal with the pandemic. Yet on the other hand, the budget has been drastically cut. And this is what we see as a major challenge that will be faced as developing countries in dealing with the pandemic, while at the same time grappling with what other modalities could be utilized to actually deal with situations like this if they arise in future. But at the moment, we're comfortable that the measures that have been shared with us by the various EMBs, we drew a lot from the experience of India. We drew a lot also from the excellent and the meticulous experience of South Korea, and we were able to learn the lessons also from our counterparts in the continent like Malawi, who conducted elections during this period. How do you deal with it under the conditions that we have in our continent? Because we can't cut and paste from elsewhere. We have to customize to the landscape and the conditions of this country. And let me thank once again Mr. Chairman. Thank you and then in the Indonesia colleagues for really having considered us to be as KPU to be among the nations or countries that can come and share the experience. And we know we are all still grappling, and bilateral engagements will still be encouraged for us to deal to deal with this. And also just to put a flag for the Association of the World Electoral Management Bodies, because we have been honored to serve as the vice chair, and we've seen the benefits of this particular body in being able to bring together people with the subject matter expertise for us to share and to learn from them. And thus, we were able to be successful in these by-elections, but the real elections are still coming. Thank you, and thanks everybody for allowing me to indulge.
Thank you, Mr. Mashinini. The audience, please join me giving best applause to Mr. Mashinini, joining us from South Africa. Yes, we do feel the same about the pandemic effect. I believe the KPU also experienced some sort of financial difficulties similar to what is happening in your country. There has been some budget cut, there has been some budget adjustment, if you like. So audience, once again, just to remind you that you can ask questions using the Q&A features, mentioning your name, your agency, and writing your question in concise and direct way. So we still have almost an hour for question and answers. We will start with reading your question that you have written in the Q&A features, and then I will also invite questions and comments from the audience here. We have the chairperson of Indonesian KPU, Mr. Arif Budiman. We have other commissioners of KPU. We have former commissioners of the KPU and other audiences that may have comments and questions. Now, let me read questions from Betty Idrus. Betty Idrus is commissioner of Jakarta, KPU in Jakarta. It's addressed to the Election Commission of India. There are 3 questions. First, how about the spread of pandemic after the elections in India? Is there any additional new clusters of pandemic because of the elections? Second, how election committee could face voters who were undisciplined of COVID protocol? Is there any effective punishment happened? And the third question, how about the voters turnout, the VTO? Much better? Do you have any cases about untrusted of technological? About untrusted of the technology that has been used in India. So, Mr. Chandra, are you still with me?
Yes.
So those are the 3 questions for you.
For the first question,
The first question, this is from Betty Idrus from KPU in Jakarta.
yeah.
How about the spread of the coronavirus after the elections in India? Is there any additional or new clusters of pandemic because of the elections? Do you have any comments on that?
Fortunately, there was no spread because of the elections at all in Bihar. And initially, when we had started conducting the elections, there were 13,000 persons in Bihar. But during the elections and after the elections, there has not been any spread of the elections of the COVID-19 patients. What is the second question?
The second question,
Hmm.
how do you treat voters who are undisciplined of COVID protocol? Is there any effective punishment that you...
Actually, there was no effective punishment, but I would say that because we ensured that the safe distancing will have to be maintained, whether it is a campaigning or a casting of the vote. And the district administration was responsible. And a lot of education programs were also conducted for the voters to maintain that particular protocol. And generally, we found that there was no particular indiscipline among the voters, and they came forward, and even the political parties, to follow that particular protocol, because they themselves knew that if they don't follow the protocol, ultimately they are going to suffer, because the pandemic will going to affect them only. So it was for their own interest. Rather, we had to conduct the programs that they should come forward to cast the vote, as I mentioned in my talk also, that they were sensitized that our polling booths are safe. The campaigning which is being done is also put into the social distancing norms, and everything is being, for the COVID-19 is being followed. So there was the better turnout. This is the third part of the question, that the better turnout from the earlier election of 2015. So that better turnout was there. There was no spread of the COVID-19 factor in the patients into that particular area. So our decision was absolutely correct, and this was vindicated by the voters of Bihar.
All right, so, and the third question, containing 2 questions actually. How about the VTO? How about the voters turnout? Is that higher or lower?
Voter turnout was higher than last time.
Okay.
That is I have already answered you, that the voter turnout was better than the elections which were held in 2015.
All right, so that ended the question. And the second part of this question, number 3, is there any case of, people distrusting the technology that you employ in the elections?
No, people, this time there was no distrust as far as the technology is concerned. Our main thing is that use of the electronic voting machine and the VVPAT. And I can tell you that as per the Supreme Court decision, the 5 VVPAT are being matched in each and every constituency. And we counted as per these norms, and there was no difference in voting which were counted and they were which were polled, and absolutely there was no discrepancy. So there was a complete trust on the EVM and VVPAT.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chandra. So Mbak Betty, mudah-mudahan sudah terjawab pertanyaannya. Pertanyaan berikutnya, the next question, if any questions sent through the Q&A. So the next question is to Dr. Wali, Dr. Manuel Wali from IFES.
Yes, Chairman.
Are you still there? Are you still with me, with us? Okay, thank you. So in order, this is the question, in order to use mail voting, is there any special prerequisites for an archipelago country like Indonesia, huge islands? Do you think it will be effective? So what is the prerequisite to the use of mail voting? And do you think it will be effective in Indonesia if we employed it?
Well, I would say the first prerequisite is an effective postal service that can deliver to every part of the country. And that is not obvious in a country like Indonesia. Even if the postal service is very effective on some of the main islands, it may not reach every island. And then you have issues of equal treatment. Where voters in certain parts of the country would have the benefit of postal voting, but not in other parts of the country. So that could be an issue. I think another prerequisite would be political will. As for now, the law of Indonesia only allows postal voting for out-of-country voters. And I'm not sure how many Indonesian diplomatic missions are already practicing postal voting for the diaspora voters. I think that would be very interesting to study that and how successful that is, and to see how satisfied voters are and what it has done to turnout, and whether there has been any manipulation or anything. I think there's now a tool set that can make postal voting very, very safe. But if you want to do it in country, I think it would be very important to study the capacity of the postal service to handle it. And also the relationship that KPU would have with the postal service. What I see in many countries is that the legal relationship between the electoral management body and the postal service is not sufficiently defined. So again, if KPU would want to do it in Indonesia, I think it would first become a political process, and you would do feasibility studies. Postal service capacity is key.
So yeah, I guess the political will is very important in this case. I really wish that there was someone from from DPR. I really wish that there was some parliamentary member here in this room following our discussions. Next question. Ini ke siapa ya? Oh, to all resource persons from Renzo del Rosario, Legal Network for Truthful Elections, the Philippines. The question is for all resource persons, for all 4 resource persons. How did you ensure effective voter education and information dissemination for populations who live in remote communities or places and that have no access to digital and online media? So these issues of access to internet. Any comment from any of the resource persons?
Yes, we have. I'm Chandra from India. Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. In our country, you know that there are a lot of multi languages, and persons are also living in villages and the remote places. So we have got a very effective voters education program called SWEEP, and we are approaching them. We are talking to them through the community radios, the FM radios, and through the vernacular language pamphlets, the paper pamphlets we are distributing. We are educating in the local community in their own languages by various persons recruited from that area. They are telling them there are electoral literacy clubs also in various villages, and they are telling about their rights, how to conduct the elections, what should be done during the elections. So we are approaching to the remotest places where there are no networks or though no WhatsApp or any other digital channel. So manually, our persons are going, educating them, and making them prepared for participation in the electoral participation program, so that they can understand their rights, they can understand how to cast vote, they can understand why it is so important to cast their votes.
Mr. Chandra, following.
Thank you. In our case, Glenn, South Africa. Thank you, Program Director. Can you hear me? Thanks. In our case in South Africa, interestingly, is that we have a high penetration of the digital technology, especially the WhatsApps and cell phones. So we don't have so much a challenge of penetration of that medium. However, I think we have the issues of languages and literacy in those areas. So we still push and rely largely on radio broadcast and community radio, because that has a higher penetration in those particular communities. Then among the young people, we're finding that the digital technology has actually taken strongly. And as such, we push messages using that, whether it is social media, WhatsApps, and so on and so forth. And we've partnered with the multinationals such as Facebook and WhatsApp and so on, so that we are in a position to deal with the accessibility of information. But on the other side, remember, we also have the downside of social media now, which is fake news. So the reliance and usage of the social media in making sure that its authentic communication and information still remains a major emphasis in our activities. And then lastly, political parties, they have their own local officials, and we work through their networks and their structures to sound the clarion call to people in those remote areas that there is elections and what is expected in the elections. But when it relates specifically, because new information had to be disseminated, this is the COVID related information. Radio was probably the strongest, and we still have a strong television coverage in those areas. But because of incomes and because of other economic dynamics, the landscape is not even. So we had to have, let me put it this way, we've had to have a what you call a smoker's board of different tools and measures of communication that we apply for the circumstances that relate to those communities. So we don't treat our audience and target audience as homogeneous. We try to customize the information for them. And then the last thing was dissemination of the visual documentation and papers, especially when we're explaining leaflets and all of those things. That helps now with respect to the protocols, what's expected, and people are able to see the visuals. And we had to make them much more simplified so that they are not actually verbose. It's just using pictures that can tell a story more than just writing. And some of that we drew from the experiences of South Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mashinini. I think it's very clear point that we should not treat the voters as the homogeneous. So, Mr. Kim and Dr. Wally, do you have any comments on this, the questions of the access? Otherwise, we will move on to the questions and
Yeah.
comments from the audience that are here in this room.
Chairman, perhaps one comment?
Yes, please.
One comment in terms of postal voting, voter information and voter education is very important in the sense to prevent voter errors when casting the postal vote. Because if voters vote by mail for the first time, they're not familiar with the process, they're not familiar with the timelines, they might mail the ballot too late, they may not know that there's a drop box, they may not know where the drop box is, they may not know that they have to sign the envelope, they may not know that they might need a witness, that it has to be dated, all of these things. And what is extremely important in that sense is the design of the postal ballot and of the envelope and of the instructions that go with it and where the instructions are placed. Just to give one example, when the signature line is on the flap side of the envelope, where the envelope is sealed, the chances are much higher that the voter does not forget to sign. So it's those things where it's about intuitive design. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Kim, are you still with us? Kayaknya Pak Kim udah nggak ada.
Hello?
Oh, okay. Yes, Mr. Kim, please.
It is very important to give information to. Okay, I think it is very important to give information to voters about election and candidate and their policies. Also, how to cast their right to vote. So first of all, we sent election information pamphlet to each house by post. The pamphlet includes the information about candidate and their policies. Also, where the voters can cast their right to vote, polling station. Also, we, as I said in my presentation, we, the National Election Commission of South Korea, run its own TV channel. It's called the Korean Election Broadcasting System. So we can use this channel to educate voters. And also we try to give information to each candidate about the document what the law they should obey when they do election campaign. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. So now I would like to invite the chairperson of KPU to make comments on the issues that has been discussed. Is there any microphone on the floor? Pak Arief Budiman, dipersilakan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gafar. I have one question for Mr. Manuel. When we are talking about posting by mail, Indonesia have an experience using mail as for voters who live abroad for the national elections. Tapi ada beberapa kendala. Biasanya ketika surat suara dikirim ke alamat yang dituju, banyak yang sudah berpindah. Kemudian kebijakan kantor pos di masing-masing negara itu kadang-kadang juga berbeda-beda, gitu ya. Jadi kadang-kadang ada yang membatasi kegiatan-kegiatan yang bernuansa politik. Nah, salah satunya adalah kepemiluan. Itu seringkali menjadi tantangan kita. Apakah memungkinkan, apalagi kalau kita akan terapkan di dalam negeri ya, Indonesia yang wilayahnya kepulauan, pasti akan membutuhkan waktu yang panjang, waktu yang lama, biaya yang cukup besar. Apakah memungkinkan dan apakah ada praktek di negara-negara lain menggantikan pemilihan melalui pos dengan pemilihan melalui email. Jadi mail will be replacing by email. Itu memungkinkan tidak dilaksanakan? Karena masing-masing tentu punya tantangannya. Ya, kalau by mail itu tantangannya tadi validitas itu juga agak merumitkan. Apalagi pengalaman kita di beberapa tempat tidak semuanya sudah menggunakan sistem barcode misalnya. Jadi ini ada tantangan kita. Nah, saya membayangkan apakah memungkinkan by mail will be replacing by email. Itu. Tantangannya apa? Dan apakah sudah pernah ada praktek di beberapa negara pemilihan menggunakan email gitu. Terima kasih Pak Gafar.
Terima kasih. There was a question for Dr. Wally, but I think it's also relevant to Mr. Chandra from India with his experience on sending the ballot paper electronically and then getting back the ballot in print through mails. Dr. Wally, did you follow the questions from Mr. Arif Budiman?
Yes, I don't speak Bahasa, so I'm not sure I understood the whole question. But if it's about electronic ballot delivery, I can say something very briefly, and then maybe the Election Commission of India can answer that too, because they have a lot of experience with that as well. I'm getting my out-of-country voting ballot delivered electronically, and in the United States, there is a federal law that's called UOCAVA, the Uniformed and Out-of-Country Americans Vote Act. And that act stipulates that Americans either serving in the public service or living abroad must be offered an electronic ballot delivery because they might be in places where the postal service is not effective, okay? So I have the option to download my ballot off the homepage of the New York Board of Elections. It's a 3-part PDF, the outer envelope, the inner envelope, and then the ballot itself and the instructions. So it's actually 4 PDFs that I download. And what the disadvantage of that system is that the voter must have the ability to print. And so there is an economic cost to exercising the vote. And those voters that may not have the ability to print may be disadvantaged. But obviously, if you live in an area that doesn't have postal service, doesn't have reliable postal service, this is the safest option. So what New York does with me is they send me a hard copy ballot, but they also offer me the PDF, and I've been using the PDF. You need very good instructions as to how to fold the envelopes and how to complete the ballot, how to seal it, and then how to post it. But I think, yes, it's a very good option, except for the issue of the necessity to be able to print.
Yeah, I think that answers most of the questions. So regarding the issue of how to send the ballot paper instead of by mail but by email to access. But that requires the voters to have email access and printers for that matter, and then to send it back to the committee.
I could happily share the New York PDFs with you, Chairman, if you're interested in those. I could send you those samples and you see how New York designed them. And again, there's many different options. The New York design is actually not particularly good. There's probably, but I'd be very interested also to see the electronic ballots that the Election Commission of India provides. That would be very interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Wally. We have 5 minutes left. Is there any final comments from the floor here? Okay, Dr. Sri Nuryanti here will have some comments instead of questions, I guess. Comments. 3 minutes.
Thank you. I just would like to give a brief comment that hosting election in Indonesia is very complicated one because we have to do it voting and casting the ballot and counting the ballot at the same day, in one day. Therefore, I think the complexity is there, a lot of complexity, a lot of accessories that have to comply with the regulation. And I think the key is the regulation. If the regulation give authority to election commission to exercise and also to decide the process of protecting the voters' right, I think it will be a lot of easier. In this case, in Indonesia, it is very limited by the verses of the election law. If the election law still be like that election only be done from 7 to 12, and then the counting start at 1, and it should be end until the last casted ballot is count, then I think we have a lot of challenges to overcome. And one other thing that I have to really congratulate all election commissioners at local level for tomorrow's event is because we have another challenge to also avoid the spread of COVID-19 virus. So I wish you all of election commissioner at provincial, municipal, and regency level to have a great and successful event tomorrow. Keep well, stay safe, and wishfully the voter turnout will be as expected. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sinuryanti. Ladies and gentlemen, that will be the last comments because we are in the last minute of our sessions here. So once again, thank you for Mr. Kim Yong-kwon, Mr. Sushil Chandra, Dr. Manuel Wali, and Mr. Glenn Moshinini, all those resource persons that have shared their experiences with us today. And thank you for all the audience who have addressed their questions, both online and offline in this room. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the sessions, and we will see you again in the next sessions or tomorrow. So saya kembalikan lagi kepada pembawa acara. Terima kasih, selamat sore, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Can we have a big applause? Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul Ghaffar Karim as a moderator. And also our speakers today, Mr. Kim Yong-kwon, Mr. Sushil Chandra, Dr. Manuel Wali, and Mr. Glenn Moshinini. And also, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome Mr. Arief Budiman. Thank you, sir, for coming this afternoon. Can we have a big applause for Mr. Arief Budiman, ladies and gentlemen? Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of this event. We thank to you all who have participated in the Election Visit Program 2020, including all participants who participate via online. And we also thank the Honorable Ones, Your Excellency, the Chairman of the General Election Commission of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Arief Budiman. Thank you for coming, sir. Honorable, the Commissioner of the General Election Commission of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Hashim Asyari. Thank you for joining with us. Honorable, the Commissioner of the General Election Commission of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Ilham Saputra. Thank you for coming. Honorable, the Commissioner of the General Election Commission of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Pramono Ubay Tantowi. Honorable the Commissioner of the General Election Commission of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. E. Dewa Rakasandi. Thank you for coming. Honorable the Commissioner of the General Election Commission of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Firian Aziz. Honorable the Commissioner of Bawaslu of the Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Fritz. Honorable the Commissioner of KPK of the Republic of Indonesia, Mrs. Lily Pintauli Siregar. Honorable Acting Official General Secretary, the Election Commission of Republic of Indonesia, Mr. Nanang Priyatna. And also Honorable Mayor of South Tangerang, Mrs. Irene Rahmi Diani. Your Excellency Ambassador and Representative of Embassies of Indonesia, various countries. Honorable Commissioner and Representative of various election management bodies. Honorable Representative of Indonesia Ministry or state agencies. Honorable Representative of NGOs, academics, and mass media, also any other honorable attendance. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming also join with us by Zoom Election Visit Program 2020. Can we have a big applause for us? Ladies and gentlemen who join via offline the Election Visit Program, then we will have briefing for polling station, which will be led by Mr. Sumarian Dono. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Sumarian Dono. Boleh berikan tepuk tangan, Bapak dan juga Ibu, biar semangat lagi.
Wabarakatuh. Selamat siang dan tetap semangat pagi. Pagi-pagi. Luar biasa. Salam kasih sayang untuk kita semua dan semoga kita semua seluruh rakyat Indonesia segera bertambah sejahtera.